In 1952, a widow named Hannelore Braun in Milwaukee cooked the same Eintopf every Sunday for 28 years. Her neighbors called it Oma's pot. She never wrote the recipe down because her hands knew it the way her mouth knew the old hymns. That meal is number 3 on this list. Number 14 was so tied to Hamburg Harbor that sailors swore it cured seasickness. Number 9 used to simmer in every Pennsylvania Dutch kitchen from Lancaster to Reading, and almost no one under 60 remembers its real name anymore. These 25 meals came across the Atlantic in the 1880s and survived 2 world wars that taught German-American families to hide their language, their letters, and sometimes even their grandmother's recipes. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 forgotten German one-pot meals for seniors living alone. Number 25. Brotsuppe, bread soup, stale bread, water, a little broth if you had it, a knob of butter if you were lucky, and whatever herbs were hanging dry in the corner of the pantry. That was the whole recipe. For centuries, German grandmothers refused to throw bread away. Bread was the brought that came with a blessing, and throwing it in the bin was an old country sin passed down through generations. So the heels and the dry slices went into a crock on the shelf, and once a week they became supper. You poured hot broth over them, let the bread melt into a thick, earthy porridge, cracked an egg into it if the chickens were laying, and ate it out of the same bowl your grandfather used before you. It cost almost nothing. It asked almost nothing of you. For a senior eating alone at a kitchen table that used to seat 8, a bowl of brotsuppe was not poverty. It was dignity warmed in a pot. Number 24. Grießbrei, semolina porridge. Milk, semolina, a pinch of sugar, sometimes a scrape of butter on top. It cooked in about 8 minutes on a single burner, and a sack of semolina from the corner grocer in Cincinnati in 1935 cost 11 cents and lasted a whole month. For German-American children, Grießbrei was the smell of a winter morning before school. For their grandparents in old age, it became the meal that still worked when nothing else did. It was soft enough for bad teeth, cheap enough for a widow's pension, and filling enough that one bowl held you until supper. Oma sprinkled cinnamon on top if she had it, and a spoonful of dark plum jam if the Zwetschgen had come in that fall. Nothing fancy, nothing modern. Just warm milk, warm grain, and the memory of a woman who used to stand at the stove humming a song in a language her grandchildren never learned. Number 23. Milchreis, rice pudding. In the Pennsylvania Dutch country of the 1940s, a pot of milchreis stayed on the back of the wood stove all afternoon. It was 1 cup of rice, 4 cups of milk, a spoon of sugar, and a strip of lemon peel if somebody's neighbor had sent one. Nothing more. The rice drank the milk slowly, the way old people drink coffee in the morning. By supper, the pot was thick and sweet, and it fed you cold the next day, and the day after that. For a German widow living on a widow's pension in 1958, milchreis was the meal that did not judge you. It did not need to be stirred every minute. It did not need teeth. It did not care that you were cooking for one in a kitchen that had once seated a husband, 4 children, and the boarder from the brewery. The pot did the remembering. You just ate. Number 22. Biersuppe, beer soup. It sounds like a joke until you remember that German breakfast tables used to have a bowl of it on cold mornings well into the 1920s. Dark beer, day-old bread, a spoon of flour to thicken it, an egg yolk stirred in at the end, and a pinch of caraway for the stomach. That was breakfast in Bavaria long before coffee was cheap, and it followed the immigrants to Milwaukee and St. Louis, where the breweries ran German from the cellar to the roof. For a grandfather who had worked the Pabst line for 40 years, a bowl of Biersuppe was not drinking. It was communion with the old country. You sipped it slowly, ate the bread that had soaked it up, and felt your grandmother's hand on your shoulder, even though she had been gone for decades. Simple, strange to modern ears, and better than any instant oatmeal the supermarket sells today. Number 21. Graupensuppe, pearl barley soup. It was the meal that kept German families alive through 2 winters of ration cards and 1 depression. A handful of barley, a ham bone if the butcher was feeling generous, carrots, onions, and whatever root vegetable was hiding in the cellar. It simmered for 2 hours on a low burner while grandmother knitted at the table by the lamp. The barley swelled until the pot was thick enough to stand a spoon in. It was cheap, it was healthy, and it was the kind of meal that a doctor in 1940 would have called a proper supper and a doctor in 2026 would call a superfood. For a senior cooking for one, a single pot of Graupensuppe fed you 4 nights in a row and tasted better on the 4th than the 1st. The old-timers knew what the nutrition magazines are only now figuring out. Barley built farmers, widows, and stubborn German grandmothers who lived past 90. Number 20. Kartoffelsuppe, potato and leek soup. 3 leeks, 5 potatoes, a quart of water, a little salt, a knob of butter, and a splash of milk at the end if there was any left in the icebox. That was the whole thing. German grandmothers in the Midwest grew leeks in the kitchen garden because they kept through the winter better than onions and tasted sweeter in a pot. The potatoes broke down until the soup was creamy without cream. It was the meal that widowed women cooked when the pension check was late and the refrigerator was nearly empty. And it was beautiful in a way that expensive restaurant versions never quite match. No cream, no bacon, no truffle oil, just the quiet taste of 2 vegetables and a little patience. For a senior cooking alone in 1989, a pot of it covered 3 nights and warmed better the second time around. Number 19. Schnippelbohnen Suppe, Pennsylvania Dutch cut bean soup. The name alone tells you where it came from. Schnippel means to snip, and that is exactly what grandmother did on the back porch in August, sitting on a wooden stool with a pail of fresh green beans and a paring knife worn down from 3 decades of use. She snipped the beans into half-inch pieces and dropped them into a crock of salt water, and by October they were sour and soft and ready for the pot. Then came the onions, the potatoes, a smoked ham hock from the butcher in Reading or Lancaster, and enough water to cover. It simmered all afternoon on the back of a cast-iron stove while the wind rattled the windows of a farmhouse that had been in the family since 1847. A senior eating alone in that same kitchen 50 years later remembered the smell before she remembered her own name. Schnippelbohnensuppe was not just a recipe. It was the last living thing that still spoke the dialect her great-grandparents had brought from the Palatinate. The children learned English in the Lutheran school. The grandchildren learned to be ashamed of sauerkraut during the World Wars, and by the 1990s, almost no one under 60 could still pronounce the word. But the pot remained. 1 ham bone, a jar of sour beans, some potatoes, and the patient heat of a Sunday afternoon. For a widow, alone in a farmhouse that used to sleep 12, the soup was a language she still understood. It fed her for a week. It cost her almost nothing. And every bowl tasted like a funeral and a family reunion at the same time. Number 18. Wirsingeintopf, Savoy cabbage stew. A head of Savoy cabbage, a pound of potatoes, a handful of carrots, an onion, and a small piece of smoked pork if the butcher had scraps that morning. Grandmother browned the onion in butter, added the cabbage, laid the potatoes on top, and let the whole thing sweat down in its own steam for an hour. That was the whole recipe. It cost about 50 cents in 1962 and fed a family of 4, which meant it fed a widow for 3 days. Savoy cabbage breaks down into something silky when it cooks long enough, and the smoked pork gives the broth a flavor that expensive bacon cannot match. For a German-American grandmother who grew up eating this once a week in the old country, a single pot in her retirement kitchen was a small act of survival dressed up as supper. It asked nothing of you except patience. Number 17. Sauerkraut Eintopf, sauerkraut stew. 1 jar of real sauerkraut, 3 potatoes, an onion, a sausage or 2 if you had them, and a cup of beef broth. Nothing else. The sauerkraut cooked until it was soft and sweet, the potatoes broke down into the broth, and the sausages warmed through in the last 10 minutes. It took 40 minutes from cold pot to full belly. During the World Wars, German-American families in the Midwest learned to stop calling it sauerkraut in public. They called it Liberty cabbage, and they hid their last names behind English spellings. But in their kitchens, at night, with the curtains drawn, the old pot still came out on Fridays. For a grandfather born in Stuttgart and buried in Milwaukee, a bowl of sauerkraut Eintopf was the one thing the war could not take from him. It tasted like home, and home was a word he was not allowed to say out loud anymore. Number 16, Bohneneintopf, bean stew, dried white beans soaked overnight, then simmered with an onion, a carrot, a stalk of celery, and a ham bone. 4 hours on low heat. That was the whole recipe. A pound of navy beans cost 9 cents in 1948, and that pound fed a widow for 5 days. German grandmothers in Cincinnati and Pittsburgh cooked Bohneneintopf on Mondays because Sunday's ham bone was still sitting in the pot, and to throw it away would have been a sin against her own mother. The beans drank the smoke from the bone, the vegetables melted into the broth, and by Monday night the pot was thick enough to eat with a fork. It was simple, it was cheap, and it was the kind of meal that a doctor would tell you to eat if you wanted to live to 90. For a German immigrant, that was not nutrition advice. It was how she had been eating her whole life. Number 15, Grünkohleintopf, kale stew. In North Germany, they waited until after the first frost to pick the kale because the cold made the leaves sweet and tender and worth the trouble. They tore the leaves off the stems by hand, washed them in a bucket of cold well water, and cooked them down with a fat sausage called pinkel and a handful of potatoes until the whole pot was dark green and steaming. It took 2 hours on a wood stove, and it smelled like every winter grandmother ever stood through. German immigrants brought the habit to Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas, where kale grew in church gardens long before the rest of America decided it was fashionable. There was a tradition up in those Lutheran farming towns. Every January, after the Christmas tree had been hauled out to the burn pile, the oldest woman in the family cooked a pot of Grünkohleintopf big enough to feed the whole street. Neighbors walked over in coats and heavy boots, carrying empty bowls. They sat at the long table in the kitchen, ate in near silence, and went home again. Nobody said a speech. Nobody needed to. The stew said it for them. For a senior living alone 60 years later in a house where that same kitchen now held a microwave and a single place setting, a pot of Grünkohleintopf was something close to a prayer. You cooked it slow. You ate it by yourself. You remembered the table full of people in boots, and then you sat at the kitchen window and watched the snow come down on a street where no one stopped by anymore. The stew fed you for 5 days. The memory fed you for longer. Number 14, Birnen, Bohnen und Speck, pears, beans, and bacon. It sounds like something made up by a restaurant in Brooklyn, but it is one of the oldest one-pot meals in North Germany, and it came across the ocean in the steerage class of ships leaving Hamburg in the 1880s. Green beans, cooked pears, smoked bacon, and a little savory herb called Bohnenkraut, all in one pot, all at once. The pears sweetened the beans, the bacon salted the broth, and the whole thing ate like a meal you could not quite classify. For a grandmother from Bremen, it tasted like the farm she had left at 17. For her grandchildren in Milwaukee 70 years later, it tasted like a story she used to tell at the table when she thought no one was listening. Cheap, strange, beautiful, and nearly extinct. Almost no one under 60 cooks it anymore. Number 13, Hackfleischtopf, a pound of ground beef, an onion, a can of tomatoes, a bag of frozen peas, a handful of macaroni, and salt. 20 minutes in one pot. German-American mothers in the 1970s called it the Monday meal because it was what happened when the weekend pot roast was gone and payday was still 3 days off. The macaroni drank the tomato, the peas kept it from looking sad, and the ground beef did the work. For a widow alone in 1985 staring at an almost empty refrigerator, Hackfleischtopf was the meal that still worked when everything else had run out. It cost less than $2, fed her for 2 nights, and reminded her of the Tuesdays when the children came home from school fighting about whose turn it was to set the table. Now, the table was empty. The pot was not. Number 12, Wurstgulasch, sausage goulash. When real beef was too expensive, German-American cooks substituted cut-up sausage. A pound of bratwurst or smoked Polish sausage sliced into coins, an onion, paprika, a little flour, a can of tomato, and a cup of beef broth. It simmered for 30 minutes. That was the whole thing. The sausage released its own fat and flavor, so you needed almost nothing else. Grandmothers in the coal towns of Pennsylvania cooked wurst goulash over the kitchen stove on Friday nights when the paycheck had stretched further than expected. It was incredible what a single link of good smoked sausage could do to a pot of onions and flour. For a senior on a fixed income in 2026, a half-pound of store-brand bratwurst still makes a better dinner than anything in the frozen aisle. The old formula still works. Cheap meat, patience, and paprika. That was all goulash ever really needed. Number 11. Kessel goulash. Kettle goulash, the real one. Cubes of cheap beef chuck, 3 pounds of onions sliced fine, a heaping spoon of sweet paprika, caraway marjoram, garlic, a splash of red wine if any was left from Sunday, and water to cover. 4 hours on the lowest possible heat. That was the whole recipe. German-American hunting clubs and fire halls cooked it in giant cast-iron kettles over a wood fire for the fall festivals in Ohio and Wisconsin. It was the kind of meal that made you close your eyes on the first spoonful. For a grandmother alone in her apartment on a Sunday in November, a small pot of it, cooked low and slow, filled the whole hallway with a smell that used to bring the neighbors knocking. Those neighbors were gone. The smell was not. She ate from the pot for 4 nights, and the last spoonful tasted as good as the first. Number 10. Pfefferpothast, Westphalian pepper pot. It is 600 years old, and it is still exactly the same 6-ingredient recipe it was in 1378, when the city of Dortmund first wrote it down. Cubes of beef, onions, bay leaves, cloves, black peppercorns, and a slice of dark rye bread crumbled into the pot at the end to thicken the broth. No tomato, no paprika, no fancy herbs, just pepper, meat, and bread. It simmered for 3 hours until the beef fell apart at the poke of a fork. For a German grandfather who had grown up eating it in a Westphalian farmhouse before he boarded a ship to New York in 1919, 1 bowl of Pfefferpothast took him home faster than any photograph. The recipe passed from his wife to his daughter to his granddaughter, and then it stopped. The great-grandchildren never learned it, but the pot is still out there, waiting. Number 9. Pot Boy, Pennsylvania Dutch chicken pot pie. Forget everything you think you know about pot pie, because the Pennsylvania Dutch version has no crust. It is a stew. A whole chicken simmered in water with salt, celery, and onion until it falls off the bone. Then you pull the meat, save the broth, and drop in thick squares of homemade egg noodle dough cut fresh on a floured board. The squares cook for 10 minutes in the hot broth, swell up, and turn the pot into a thick steaming bowl of noodles, chicken, and potato. That was Sunday dinner in every Lutheran and Mennonite farmhouse from Lancaster County to York County from the 1860s straight through to the 1970s. The recipe came over with the Palatinate Germans in the early 1700s, and it survived because every grandmother taught her daughters to make the noodle dough by feel. No measuring cups, no timer. Just flour, eggs, salt, a little water, and the memory in your hands. If you made it right, the noodles were thick and chewy and soaked up the broth like bread. If you made it wrong, grandmother stood behind you at the stove and corrected you without saying a word. For a widow alone in a farmhouse kitchen in 2026, a pot of Pot Boy took 4 hours from start to finish and fed her for a week straight. She cut the dough on the same board her mother had cut it on in 1954. She rolled it with the same rolling pin, the wood worn smooth in the middle where 1,000 Sunday afternoons had pressed it down. She still remembered her grandmother's hands on top of her own, guiding them the first time, showing her how thick to cut the squares and how to flour the board so nothing stuck. And when she sat down at the long table with a single steaming bowl, she was the only person left in the whole family who still remembered how her great-grandmother had said the word out loud. Pot Boy, 2 syllables, 300 years old, almost gone. Number 8. Labskaus, the Hamburg sailor's dish that looks terrible and tastes like a miracle. Corned beef, potatoes, onions, and pickled beets mashed together in a cast-iron pan until the whole thing turns pink. On top goes a fried egg, a rolled herring, and a pickle on the side. It sounds wrong. It eats right. German sailors ate it at sea because it used up the scraps of salted meat and beets that were left in the barrels after a long voyage, and it became the breakfast of longshoremen in the port of Hamburg for 2 centuries. German immigrants brought it to the docks of Baltimore and Hoboken and New Orleans, where their sons worked the same kind of waterfront jobs. For a retired dock worker in 1978, a plate of labskaus was not a meal. It was a passport stamp to a life he had lived 30 years ago and could still taste with his eyes closed. Number 7. Königsberger Klopse. Königsberg meatballs in a creamy caper sauce, named after a Prussian city that does not exist on the map anymore. Königsberg was destroyed in the war and renamed Kaliningrad, and the Germans who used to live there were scattered across the world with almost nothing except the recipes they remembered. A pound of ground veal and pork mixed with a soaked bread roll, an egg, an onion, and a pinch of lemon peel. You rolled them into balls, dropped them into simmering beef broth, and when they floated, you pulled the broth aside and whisked flour, butter, and capers into it to make a thick, tangy sauce. For a grandmother born in Old Königsberg in 1930 and living out her last years in a small apartment in Chicago, a pot of klopse was the only piece of her birthplace that the war had not managed to erase. She cooked it every Friday. Number 6. Pickelsteiner. The Bavarian mixed meat stew from the village of Pickelstein, invented in 1847 at a local festival and eaten at that same festival every year since. Cubes of beef, pork, and lamb layered in a pot with carrots, celery, leeks, potatoes, and cabbage, seasoned with salt, pepper, and parsley, covered with broth, and cooked slowly for 2 hours without stirring. The trick was the layering. Each vegetable stayed in its own section and kept its own color and flavor, and when you served it, you spooned straight down through all the layers so every bowl held a little of everything. For a German-American grandfather in Cincinnati who had eaten it as a boy at his village festival back in Bavaria, one pot on a Sunday afternoon in 1971 was a small and private return home. He ate it at the same table his grandfather had built out of oak in 1902. He ate it alone. Number 5. Goulaschsuppe. Not the thick stew, but the soup version, which Germans borrowed from Hungary and made their own. Cubed beef browned in lard, a mountain of onions cooked to amber, sweet paprika, caraway, garlic, diced potato, a bay leaf, a splash of red wine vinegar, and enough beef broth to turn the whole thing into a deep red soup. 90 minutes on a low burner. It was the meal that German-American beer halls in Milwaukee and New York served to factory workers for lunch for 50 cents a bowl during the Depression. A working man could eat it standing up at the bar in 10 minutes and feel full until dinner. For a senior alone in a cold apartment in January, a pot of Goulaschsuppe was the kind of meal that warmed you from the inside out for 3 days in a row. Cheap beef, slow heat, and a lot of paprika. That was all it ever needed. Number 4. Geisburger Marsch. The Swabian beef and spätzle stew named after a military training march in the village of Geisburg, where soldiers in the 1800s walked from their barracks in Stuttgart to a tavern at the edge of town every day at noon for a bowl of it. Boiled beef sliced into ribbons, diced potatoes, homemade spätzle, beef broth, and fried onions spooned over the top at the very end. Nothing else. The soldiers ate it in 5 minutes and marched back. German immigrants from Swabia carried the recipe to the Amana colonies in Iowa and to the German neighborhoods of Buffalo and Cleveland, where grandmothers made it every Monday with the leftover beef from Sunday dinner. For a Swabian grandmother in old age, a bowl of Geisburger Marsch on a Monday afternoon was the taste of her entire childhood. Her mother had made it. Her mother's mother had made it. And now she was the last one in the family who still knew how. Number 3. Kartoffelsuppe. Oma's potato soup. 5 potatoes, 2 carrots, a leek, an onion, a bay leaf, a little marjoram, and a piece of smoked sausage cut into coins. Simmered in beef broth for 40 minutes, mashed half the pot with a fork to thicken it, and finished with a swirl of butter. That was grandmother's recipe, and every German grandmother in America had a version of it, and every version was the best one. For a senior alone on a Sunday afternoon in 1993 in a little apartment outside Pittsburgh, a pot of Kartoffelsuppe still worked the way it had worked in 1943 on the farm she had grown up on. It asked almost nothing of her. It gave her 3 nights of warm suppers, and when she closed her eyes on the first spoonful, she could hear her grandmother humming a song in German at a stove in a farmhouse that had been torn down 4 decades ago. Number 2. Wirsingeintopf, lentil stew, the ultimate German frugal meal. A pound of dried brown lentils, an onion, a carrot, a potato, a bay leaf, a dash of vinegar at the end, and a single smoked sausage for flavor. 90 minutes on a low burner. A pound of lentils cost 15 cents in 1965 and fed a family of 6, which meant it fed a widow for a week. Lentils were the meal that German Lutherans ate on New Year's Day for good luck and on every other day for survival. They were cheap, they were rich in iron, they kept in the pantry for years, and they never asked you to explain yourself. For a German grandmother from Saxony who had fed her 5 children on Wirsingeintopf through the hungry years after the war, a single small pot in her American kitchen 40 years later was a quiet act of gratitude that she had lived long enough to make it again. Number 1. Erbsensuppe mit Würstchen, split pea soup with sausage. The number 1 German one-pot meal for a reason. A pound of yellow split peas, an onion, a carrot, a leek, a potato, a smoked ham hock, a few peppercorns, and water. 2 hours on the back of the stove. The peas broke down into a thick golden porridge that coated a wooden spoon. At the end, you dropped in 2 fat German sausages to warm through, and you ate a bowl the size of your head. It was the meal that German soldiers carried in their canteens in the 1870s, that immigrant mothers fed their children at Ellis Island in 1892, and that Oktoberfest tents in Milwaukee still serve today. Cost to a widow in 2026, under $3 a pot. Nights it feeds her. 4. For a German grandmother alone at a kitchen table that used to seat a husband and 3 grown sons, a bowl of Erbsensuppe was not just supper. It was her whole family in one pot, still keeping her company after all these years. This week, make one of these. Just one. Maybe the Wirsingeintopf because it is simple and cheap, or the Kartoffelsuppe because your grandmother used to make it, or the bot boy because somebody in your family tree once called it by that name and you never knew why. Do not use a microwave. Do not eat it over the sink. Set a place at the table, the real one, the one with the chairs nobody sits in anymore. Put out a cloth napkin if you have one. Pour yourself a glass of something cold. Eat it slow, because these meals were never just about being German. They were about keeping a whole world alive in a pot of broth when nothing else in that world was coming back. They were the last thread between an Oma in the old country and a grandchild in an American suburb who never learned to say her name out loud. Drop a comment and tell me which one you are going to make. I want to know if Erbsensuppe gets more love than the Sauerkraut Eintopf. I want to know if anyone else's Oma used to hum in a language her grandchildren never learned. Because these are not just recipes. They are the last proof that a family once spoke German at an American kitchen table, and that the table still remembers.